Hey there, APUSHers. Thanks for watching me and being online and giving this a shot, trying it out with the French and Indian War. Welcome, welcome. I'm seeing I'm online right now, and we're giving it a shot, trying this out with the French and Indian War. This weekend, Ms. Povich and I will be streaming the Big Four, getting ready for your APUSH exam. So, women, African Americans, immigrants, and Native Americans. But since we're starting our review on Period 3 tomorrow, at least for tutoring before and after school, I thought I would start off with the big event that really launches Period 3, and that's the French and Indian War. It's also known as the 7-Year War, and I'll explain that here in a little bit, even though technically it really lasts 9 years, because the war really starts off on the continent of the United States, or what's known as the United States now, but then it spills over into a larger conflict in Europe that lasted 7 years. So that's kind of why it was called that. Okay, so let's move on here, I think. Hold on a sec. Okay, so the biggest reason that this really starts is because of the rivalry that existed between the French and the British. In 1750, the rivalry became very serious, especially as they encroached upon the territory in the United States. In particular, the Ohio River Valley was a very contentious area during that time period. And if you take a look at this here, they went to war themselves in their own continent in Europe 3 times before 1750. So this rivalry spills over into the United States or into the colonies during that time period. And like I said, the Ohio River Valley in particular becomes a very disputed area between the two of them. So as they're growing, you can see along this eastern seaboard, these were the British territories or control. Over here are the Spanish in Florida, and the French were like along the Mississippi River Valley. But as time went on, after 1700, when you get a little closer to this to 1750s, they begin to spread. So you can see the claims growing over here, and this becomes an issue. And this kind of lined area are the disputed areas. This area right here is known as the Ohio River Valley, and that's going to be a very large disputed area, mainly because the land was so incredibly fertile. There was such great fur trading during that time. I'm going to just make sure that there's no questions, because I can't see this, that there's no questions or anything. At least I can't see that I have any questions coming. Yeah. Oh, I see one person's watching. Well, maybe it's me. Nope, nobody's watching anymore. People are gone. Anyway, but that's okay. We're just giving it a try anyway. Okay. I didn't know it was going to do that. Sorry. So this is the area again, the Ohio River Valley, the very contested area that they disputed over in particular. We can't forget about the fact that the Europeans weren't the ones that were actually the only ones there. The Indians themselves were there in the area, and the French and the British, of course, had different kinds of relationships with the Native Americans, the Indians that existed there. As we talked about in the review earlier today, the French and the British are the ones that had the French and the Dutch are the ones that had the good relationship with the Native Americans, mainly because of the fact that they allowed intermarriage. The English simply didn't want to convert them really, although there's some small groups of the British did. Most of the time they just wanted their land, and they wanted it for economic reasons. So the French easily made alliances with the Indians, in particular the Hurons, which are up in this area over here. Now the group that did align with the British were called the Iroquois, and that's in the kind of like upstate New York, modern today's upstate New York area. But that's mainly because the Iroquois Indians had a big rivalry with the Hurons, and there were several wars that had occurred between the two groups before that. So, the very first time that the colonies really kind of come together, because you have to understand that when the colonies did form, they formed very distinctly two different or three different very distinct regions. And even within those regions, they considered themselves, their own colonial government. They had their own colonial governor. And so they really didn't have any need to get together and talk. But now with this issue, with the Indians, the growing encroachment, and the growing problems with the Indians. But in addition to that, the growing problems between the French and the British, the British colonists met in Albany, New York, at the Albany Congress in 1754, and Ben Franklin famously proposes a plan called the Albany Plan of Union, in which he states that in order to be able to fight off the French, they had to join together. This is the first time that the colonies really talk about joining together in a fight. Now, at this point, they're fighting with the British. Later on, they're actually going to be fighting against the British, because at this time, the colonists consider themselves very happy British citizens. And this is our very first American history political cartoon. So this is important. It's the join or die one. A lot of students get this mixed up and think that this was designed only for, they was only designed for the War of Independence, but actually this was designed to fight off the French during the French and Indian War. Now later on, yes, they do use it for this idea that separated, they can't join together or fight the British, but together they can be, I'm sorry, the British, now I said it, they can join together and fight the French, but joining together, they could actually fight against them. Otherwise, if they separate, they die, as it shows in this snake here. Okay, so the war itself begins in 1754 and it lasts until 1763. Many places will refer to this as the 7 Years' War. It's the same war, it just starts a little bit earlier in the colonies. And so the war is actually between, because this confuses a lot of students, the British and the North American colonists versus the French and their colonies. Oops, I forgot it does this. They're going to rumble, for sure.
Ladies and gentlemen.
All right, we'll make you this larger war in Europe, known as the 7 Years' War, which technically starts in 1756. And this was really caused, like many wars, as a competition between the empires at the time period. And so you know that in APUSH, although this might disappoint a lot of our military historians, that we don't really cover the war itself very much. It does end with the very first Treaty of Paris, and we know it gets confusing because there are several treaties of Paris in U.S. history, but this will be the first one, the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And as a result of it, the British win this, and the French pretty much get expelled almost entirely from the North American continent, with the exception of Haiti, which they'll lose in a slave revolt a little later on. But essentially, the France lost Canada. They lost a lot of its empire actually in India, and they lost all of the claims east of the Mississippi River. Okay, and so that was a big punch for them. Spain, for their help, they got the lands west of the Mississippi, so they got these areas here, but they did lose, Florida to England. And England, of course, gains all the lands in Canada, which is why Canada was a British colony for a very long time. And they gained all the land all the way to the Mississippi River. All right, so this kind of gives it a visual. This is 1754, the beginning of the French and Indian War, and this is the end of it. So you can see essentially, the French being the one in the pink here, they essentially got kicked out except for Haiti over here. So this was a big L for the French, definitely in the French and Indian War. By the way, Napoleon's going to remember this. He's going to come back and kick butt in Europe in the Napoleonic Wars. That is until Waterloo. But he's going to remember this, and he's going to take this land back eventually. And then Thomas Jefferson in 1803 famously buys that land back, or that land to expand, in the Louisiana Purchase. So a lot of history behind it. Now, the French and Indian War, why we as historians feel this is very important is because it really does change the relationship between the British and the colonists. Before this happened, the colonists had enjoyed very much a lot of their own autonomy. They were an ocean apart. The British didn't have any real reason to enforce a lot of the laws like the Navigation Acts that they had passed. But after the French and Indian War, they have a problem, and that problem was debt. And seeing as how they saw the colonists as or the colonies as something that, would have to, was basically there in order to benefit the mother country, they're going to look to the colonies to collect on that debt. Now, the colonists, most of the reason many of them fought was to gain more land. As a matter of fact, George Washington fought in the French and Indian War, and he and many other officers that fought in the French and Indian War were promised land in the Ohio River Valley. Knowing how valuable that was, the fact that that was not going to come to be, at least not until later, that was going to become a big issue. The other thing the colonists gained during this is military experience, but a different kind of military experience. They learn a lot of guerrilla tactics that they gained from the Native Americans during this time period, and so we're going to see a lot of these guerrilla tactics used in the Revolutionary War. Okay, and you can see this is the big problem here. Here is the British colonies, what's known as the eastern part of the United States today. Here's where England is, and they're an ocean apart. Okay, and for a long time they just kind of ignored the British, or ignored the colonists there for a long time. Okay, like I said, the biggest issue really was about money, was the fact that there was an enormous war debt, because not only were they fighting a war against the French in the British colonies, they were also fighting a war against the French in Europe, and so that becomes a big issue with money. Okay, and so Parliament expects the colonists to be paying back a lot of that money. One of the biggest issues was the blank check that England gave their prime minister at that time, which really led to those huge war debts. And so now the Parliament has a decision to make. How are they going to have the colonists pay for that? And to the colonists, was that really fair? Which, of course, we know that they don't think that was. Another issue was the fact that, now they have the Indians that had aligned themselves with the French that are in these territories that were disputed. Now what does Great Britain do with the Indians? What do they do to try to patch up relationships with the Indians? One of the biggest problems that was in the back country of a lot of these colonies, and when I say back country at that time, I'm talking about the western part of Pennsylvania, the western part of the Carolinas, the western part of Virginia. Those areas were the most contentious areas where a lot of these Indians were. But now you have to think about the fact that the land was going to extend all the way to the Mississippi River. Okay, and the colonists fully expected to be able to expand west to the Mississippi River. Okay, so this becomes a really big issue. Vigilante groups, those are groups that kind of take the law into their own hands. They get very upset about the Indian issue. And they didn't feel that the colonial governments, which were supported by the imperial governments in England, were helping them. They felt that they were very corrupt, and in many ways they were probably very right. But two of the really big examples of this were somebody known as the North Carolina Regulators, the South Carolina Regulators, two different groups, and the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania. And so here's where they were located. This is what I'm talking about, the backcountry area. And this is the area where they have so many of the Native American clashes. The Paxton Boys, in particular, here in western Pennsylvania, the Quakers were trying to have very good relationships with the Native Americans when these people in this area, in the western Pennsylvania area, were having such a difficult time with the Indians, and and the colonial government wouldn't help. They took it into their own hands. They slaughtered Indians, and in retaliation, they also blew up a train owned by the king, and then they marched all the way to Philadelphia. So the Paxton Boys themselves were an example of like a backcountry vigilante group. Eventually, they're kind of put back or put down. But what's really ironic about America in this time period is that the Eastern Seaboard, they're the ones that are really talking about, rights and equal representation. In the meantime, the people in the western Pennsylvania part, they didn't have equal representation that the people in the eastern part of the seaboard did either. So a lot of like hypocrisy going on here. Another thing that happens immediately after the French and Indian War was Pontiac's rebellion. So there was an Ottawa chief by the name of Pontiac that refused to accept the fact that the British had won the French and Indian War. And so they attacked British forts that had flooded like the Ohio River Valley. Now, even though actually Pontiac dies, many of the Indian groups saw that as kind of inspirational for them to rise up. So the Pontiac's rebellion was actually a series of rebellions by many different Native American tribes at the time that like just completely, rose up against British authority. Now, when this happens, they do eventually put down the Native American rebellion. This causes the British to really say, you know what, maybe we should rethink allowing the colonists to settle, because not only is it obvious that the Native Americans are going to be settling out west, or going to be trouble out west, but it's going to cost money to protect the colonists. So, Pontiac's War itself really became a big issue. Okay, and so in kind of response to Pontiac's rebellion and to the French and Indian War, the British government set what I really think is in motion of the very first of the many dominoes that lead us up to the Revolutionary War. And this is the proclamation line of 1963. Whoa, way off. Of 1763. So this line here, essentially around the Appalachian Mountain area. So they've still got all this area right here that they were technically supposed to have, or is really British owned, but they leave it for the Indian Reserve. And so basically it forbade the colonists from like moving out west. Obviously the colonists are very upset about this. They felt like Parliament was making decisions for them that they shouldn't, that the colonial governments were really the ones that should represent them. We're going to see this issue when taxation becomes a problem too. And they also believed that if they helped the British fight in this war, that land was land that they deserved to have. Okay, so this really marks the end of what's known as salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect was something that the British observed before the French and Indian War, because it was just too much trouble to try to control and enforce a lot of these laws, like the Navigation Acts, in which they were supposed to only trade with the British and blah, 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 in order to like support the mercantilist system. So, the French and Indian War brings an end to this salutary neglect. English officials assumed that they had all ultimate authority over the colonies themselves, and so the British began to really monitor and govern the colonies much more strictly. They had never really watched over them before, so this is going to cause quite a bit of rebellion. So here's a couple memes to kind of have you understand that. So one is, here's King George here saying he can't see what those colonists are doing over there. This is before the French and Indian War. This is salutary neglect, and this is, of course, after the French and Indian War. They don't tolerate the end of salutary neglect. So that's kind of obviously what they say. And when I say about what it's like As we know, at high school, the dress code is hard to enforce. And so I try to have you guys relate it to it's eighth period, it's the end of the day. And here's your teacher. Your teacher is England. Wait, what are you wearing? You're the British colony here. What do you mean? I've been wearing this all day. Yeah, I don't care. Go to the front office. So now your eighth period teacher is the one enforcing the dress code. You have to be kidding me. Now you care? So this is salutary neglect. Exactly. Okay? So it's going to mean much later on that new taxes and new laws are going to be passed in order without asking the colonial assemblies. The parliament felt that they had virtual representation, the colonies did, and they should stop complaining because they have representation that they're operating in their best interests. Um, and the British colonies, they try to hold on to a lot of their power in the colonial assemblies. They're going to clash. But this is really going to be the beginning of the end of the relationship between the British and the British colonies, who, today we know is the United States. This is going to be the really big first step to it. Okay, so that is it. That's all I've got. And I don't know how long that was, but hopefully you got a little glimpse into the French and Indian War, and I got a little bit of practice so I can see what I need to improve on and stuff like that for Saturday and Sunday's podcast, or not podcast, I guess, live stream. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye bye.